I'd like to read these same verses this morning in preparation for Daryl's lesson. Matthew 5, verses 3 through 10. Blessed are the pure in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Thanks, Darby. Good morning, everybody. And to everybody online, thanks for being with us today. Hope everyone has had a good week. Hope you're comfortable and that you've already been blessed by the time of worship together. I know that the songs that Richard picked out for us are really meaningful. They really point to things that we need to be reminded of about how we're supposed to live as God's people. We have a lot going on in our nation right now. You probably noticed. We're just a couple of weeks away from an election, which means that we are coming into the real throes of, the campaign season. And say what you will, wherever you fall on that spectrum, I really believe that all believers should seek to have an influence on the upcoming election. And what I mean by that is, and I will have to get my, did I bring it? Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that all believers should seek to have an influence on the election. What I mean by that is what Paul suggests here in 1 Timothy 2. He says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and for those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. And so I think what that means is that even if you don't consider yourself a particularly political person, that's one from the lesson today. And by the end of this message, you will have another one, so please stay tuned for that. It is sad, but not surprising, the truth that one of the most divisive forces in our nation is politics. And my humble opinion is that it has only gotten worse over the past 20 years or so. I don't know if anybody else would agree with that. Anybody feel the divisiveness getting worse? Of course, that isn't the only thing that we find to divide over. Things like age and gender and class and culture, ethnicity, religion, all of these have been used as a reason to kind of separate people into us versus them. They're either part of our culture or part of our ethnicity or they're not, and so we've got us versus them. But it has been that way throughout human history, and the world was like that when Jesus came into it as well. And to that world, and I think into our world today, Jesus speaks this word, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." And I hope you don't mind me saying again that in this sermon that we have been reading from in Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus is declaring that the kingdom reign of God has now come near to those who are willing to live under it. And these Beatitudes are descriptions of the true happiness that we find when we are willing to say to the Lord, "Let your kingdom come. Let your kingdom come into my life." And whenever we're willing to do that, then we do find these blessings, including, the blessedness, the joy, the peace that comes as a part of that. So we want to consider Jesus' words carefully here, though. What did Jesus mean by peace? Many of the Jewish people who were listening to him that day probably had a very different idea of it than what Jesus had in mind. They had been foretold by the prophets that whenever the Messiah came, that the blessing of peace was one of the things which he would establish among them. In fact, in Isaiah 9, chapter 9, verse 6, one of the names for the Messiah was actually Prince of Peace. So obviously, this is one of the ways that he is identified. And making peace was central to the mission of Messiah when he came, to the mission of Jesus. But he had his work cut out for him, trying to work out that mission among people who not only had misunderstood what that peace meant, but they were in fact working against his peace. For many of them, peace meant being freed from the rule of the Romans. It meant Israel being restored to the position of power and authority and prosperity that they had known under, let's say, under David and under Solomon 1,000 years before. But that was not his mission. We know that they got it wrong because even by the end of Jesus' 3 years of teaching and declaring the good news among his people, they still didn't get it. You may recall that as Jesus approached Jerusalem for the final time, a few days before he was crucified, his heart was grieved. It was broken. Do you remember why? What was he upset about? Yeah. As he approached the city, Luke 19 tells us, as he approached it and saw the city, he wept over it. And he said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it's hidden from your eyes." Of course, he goes on to talk about, or to describe some of the things that we talked about in the 9 o'clock hour that Richard discussed with us about the coming destruction that was coming to the city. But even on the very night when Jesus was betrayed, just before he was handed over, he tried to comfort his followers with these words. He said, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." I think these two passages together, they raise some important questions for us. Do we know the way that leads to peace? Jesus said, "My own people don't even know the way that would bring peace." Do we know it? And is that what we are pursuing? Or are we seeking the kind of peace that the world gives? My peace I give you, but not in the way that the world gives peace. So what Jesus had in mind was rooted in the Jewish idea of peace. Does anybody remember what the Hebrew word for peace is? Yeah, shalom. Good. So it appears 237 times in the Old Testament. But rather than just meaning tranquility or serenity or the absence of violence, it refers to wholeness, to completeness, or to fullness. By the way, the meaning of the Greek word, erenes, is similar. It means, the Greek word means to take two different things that were separated and join them together into one. That's what the root of it comes from anyway, translated peace, but that's what the root of the meaning is. And so shalom is the world as God intended. Okay? It's not just a temporary state, something that comes and goes as circumstances change. It is something bigger than that. It's life as God meant it to be. It is the world as God intended. That is the state of God's shalom. And sometimes it occurs, this is the noun, sometimes it occurs in the verb form. When it is used as a verb, it's sometimes referred to what was needed to restore relationships to wholeness, broken relationships to wholeness. So, for example, in Exodus 22, if a man stole an ox or a sheep, then he would have to go back to the neighbor to restore it. And then that action of putting things right, of mending that broken relationship, is actually called shaloming. I mean, I'm making an English word out of it, right? But it is doing shalom, okay? It is peacemaking. So shalom is what results when people live at peace with God and at peace with each other. It was so much a part of the Jewish culture that it became the literal words that you would use to greet somebody or to say farewell to them. Okay? Instead of saying hello, someone might say to you, Shalom Aleichem, which means peace or well-being to you. And that's what you said instead of howdy or whatever, something much more meaningful, I think, It was a blessing and a greeting sort of combined into one. Jesus himself, as well as the New Testament writers, expressed greetings in that way. You might remember when he suddenly appeared before the disciples after the resurrection. Remember what he said? He said, "Peace be unto you." Well, that's how you greeted each other. And people in the Middle East still use similar greetings to this day. But even though we have a sense of how things ought to be, that peace is a good thing, it's a desirable thing, we humans have never been very good at maintaining it for very long. It has always been a strategy of the devil to find ways to drive a wedge between us. Satan divides in order to conquer. And unfortunately, it works really, really well. You'll recall that the first conflict that we see in the Bible, going all the way back to Genesis 3, first of all, in Genesis 1 and 2, we see this picture of Eden, and it really is a paradise. It really is a picture of shalom, of the world and life as it was meant to be. But in chapter 3, the serpent slithers into the story, right? The first thing he wants to do is to come between the humans and God, to find some way to drive that wedge between them. And so he gets them to doubt whether what God has told them really is what's best for them. Maybe things could be better if we just take matters into our own hands instead of trusting God and what he said about this, right? We still fall for that one all the time, don't we? Trusting ourselves rather than what God has told us. Well, Eve and Adam rebel against God. They eat the fruit that they had been forbidden to eat. And the next time they meet with the Lord, the human beings are acting a little bit strange, a little bit weird. They're behaving differently. And when they hear the sound of God walking in the garden, instead of being glad, what are they feeling? They're afraid, right? And they hide. And when the Lord asked them why, Well, things start to unravel pretty quickly after that. The man says, the woman that you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it, right? So Adam is pointing fingers in two different directions. Neither one pointed at himself, right? But he says, the woman that you gave me, God, okay, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. And then God asked the woman, well, what is this that you have done? And she's like, me? And verse 13 says, the serpent deceived me. This is Eve speaking here. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. And so she's pointing over in that direction. But in one fell swoop, the couple was alienated from God, and that led to conflict with each other. Their fellowship with God and one another was ripped apart. And things just, as you keep reading through Genesis, things just keep spiraling downward more and more as you see the breakdown of human relationships, as you see them drifting farther and farther away from God. And we have struggled to have a peaceful relationship with God and with one another ever since. Well, humans by themselves are incapable of making peace. It takes the Prince of Peace to establish real and lasting peace. Of course, God knew all of this was coming before it happened. He has always had in mind to provide a way to restore shalom, to bring that back. Ephesians 1 says that before the creation of the world, God had a plan to reconcile us and to make us holy and blameless in his sight. Before any of it ever transpired, before the first human being ever came to be, before creation, God had already planned what he was going to do in order to reconcile people to himself. And then chapter 2 of Ephesians goes on to tell us how that was going to happen. Beginning in verse 13, Paul writes, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our shalom. He is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. In other words, he fulfilled the law and set it aside out of the two, thus making peace. Now, the two groups, of course, that are being referred to here are the Jews and the Gentiles, or non-Jewish people. And that distinction was really one of the most important facets of Israel's identity. You know, if you didn't know anything else about yourself as a Jew, you know, I'm not one of those Gentiles, okay? I'm not one of them. We have a law from God. They don't. They don't acknowledge our God, and therefore we have nothing to do with them. And what Ephesians 2 is telling us is that that barrier no longer exists. Through Jesus, the Jews can be reconciled to God. You know, they had rebelled against him. They had fallen away from their covenants. And through Jesus, the pagan Gentiles can be also reconciled to God. The way of restoring shalom with God has been provided through the cross of Jesus. And once that had been accomplished, there's no longer any barrier between Jews and Gentiles. And so Paul also writes in Colossians 1, God was pleased to have all his fullness, all of his completeness, to dwell in him, in Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself, here Paul writes, all things, okay? Not just the people who had estranged themselves from God, but all things, everything that has come under the curse of sin. Now all things are going to be reconciled to him, whether things on earth, things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So this is a big idea throughout Scripture, right? That when we get right with God, it opens the way for us to be at peace with one another. This is how real peace, this is how lasting peace comes about. That's why when one or hopefully both spouses in a marriage come to know the Lord, when they get reconciled to Him, it makes it possible for them to know love in a deeper way than was ever possible before. You know, it is a great thing when the shalom of God envelops a family, right? When you live under that peace that comes from God. There's nothing that binds a family together better than that. It's why some churches are able to pull together and to do remarkable things in the world because Jesus has made peace among those people. And so the shalom of God is over them, and it works through them in a way that people who are pulling in different directions can't hope to achieve. And this, of course, is what God intended. All right? This shalom is the world as God intended. That His kingdom, His reign, and His shalom would increase on the earth through His people. Jesus said, peacemakers will be known as God's children. All right? Remember, that's the blessing of the Beatitude. Blessed are the peacemakers because they will be called, what? Children of God. Okay. And that is central, not only to Jesus' mission, but it is central to what it means to be a daughter or a son of God. When a person is God's child, we expect them to look like their dad, right? And that's how God is. This, by the way, is the other call to action in the message, is that this is what we're called to be. We're called to be peacemakers. 2 Corinthians 5 tells us this, that we've stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. You know, the world has all kinds of ways that they evaluate people, that they sum them up, that they classify them. And Paul says we've stopped doing that. We don't evaluate people from a human point of view. At one time, we thought of Christ merely from a human point of view and how differently we know Him now. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. A new life has begun. And all of this is a gift from God who has brought us back to Himself through Christ. And God has given us this task of reconciling people to Him. So, we're Christ's ambassadors. God's making His appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. You may think, I'm not gifted to be an evangelist, I'm not a very good Bible teacher, and that's okay. God gives us different gifts for different reasons according to His wisdom. But to everyone, He has given the mission of making peace, because that's part of what it means to be a child of God. And how do we do that? Well, certainly by what we say and what we do, we need to point people to Jesus, who can alone bring the shalom of God into their lives. But also, and Paul writes this in his letter to the Romans, Romans chapter 12, he gives this bit of advice to us, those of us who would be peacemakers, all right? He says, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now that's a big ask, okay? As far as it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Okay? If I have a relationship that is strained, that is not at peace, and I'm not praying for wisdom or patience, in order to deal with that, then that is something that depends on me. And that's something that I can do, I can respond to. If I am the one in that relationship who is still gossiping about the other person, then I can do something about that. If I'm the one refusing to forgive, then again, that's something that depends on me that I can change. I cannot control the other person. We all know that. You can't force them to do anything. But most of the time, there are things that depend on me that I can lean into more than I have. So we need to examine our own hearts to be sure that we are not the ones who are, as they say these days, who are canceling people. We're not the ones dismissing people out of hand. We're not the ones drawing lines between ourselves and others the way that the world and the way that they do. I expect most of us know the name Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian back during the time of Stalin, and he was sentenced to 8 years in a gulag for speaking critically of Joseph Stalin. So off to the gulag he went for 8 years. And then I believe the rest of his life he spent in exile. So he was never actually able to go back home. But at first, or I suppose, no, at some point he was released, wasn't he? But anyway, long time in the gulag, a long time in exile, let's put it that way. But at first he was very bitter about that, as one might expect. But then that changed. And many years later, in the book that he wrote about that, his experience in that time, he wrote this. He says, "It was only when I was laying there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of something good. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. If only that's how it was. But it's not." So the line dividing good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. And so, sin is what divides the world. And sin is in all of us. And the peace of God is what is needed to heal all of us. The United Nations is currently involved in 12 different peacekeeping missions around the world. They're mainly focused in 3 different regions of the world, in Asia, in Africa, and in Europe. 4, also the Middle East. But it involves about 90,000 field personnel. Of course, we can be thankful for the work that they do to bring stability and to try to nurture peace in those difficult areas of the world. But the Church of Jesus Christ is made up of over, if you believe the internet, over 2 billion people that are spread all across the face of the earth. And Jesus may never send you to Kosovo or to Kashmir or to the Congo, some of the areas where the UN is now. But if you are a follower of Jesus, he has already dispatched you. Okay? You have already been deployed. You've been sent on a peacekeeping mission, a peacemaking mission. It's one reason why he has you in that office setting where you are, or even if you're working at home, why he has you interacting, with some of the people that he does, or people in your family, people in your neighborhood. He has you there on a peacemaking mission. We're there in order to, as field agents, if you will, in order to keep making shalom in the name of Jesus. And so as we do that, people will see, hopefully, that we are not the ones who are trying to push people apart. Okay? When there's a lot of dissension stirred up among people, we're not the ones pouring on the gasoline, right? We're the ones trying to bring people back together and by bringing them to God. And as Jesus said, as we do this, then we will be known as the children of God because we will look like our Father. And so, insofar as any of us have any interaction with other people, and we all do, we have that calling to be peacemakers. And we also have the promise of the blessedness of the joy that will come as a part of that. And so we want to end with a prayer this morning, but it's the prayer in the form of a song. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. So let me encourage you to sing that.